Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar entitled The Role of Urban Spaces in War and Peacebuilding. My name is Johanna Mannegren. I'm Associate Professor in Peace and Development Studies at Södertörn University, and I'm also Associate Researcher here at the Swedish Institute of International Affairs. And so this webinar will then explore the use of urban spaces in war and post-war settings. Why are cities so important in war? And why are cities so important in peace? Why have places like Sarajevo, Aleppo, Mariupol become such epicenters of terrible violence? And of course, as we speak now, the fighting in Khartoum is going on. So these are very pressing questions, especially considering that I just saw some numbers from the International Red Cross that estimates that around 50 million people are affected by urban warfare at this very moment. So in order to discuss these topics, we have two very prominent researchers with us today. And let me first introduce Kristin Ljungkvist. You are Senior Lecturer in War Studies at the Swedish Defence University. Welcome.
Thank you.
And also we have Gusic. You are Assistant Professor in Political Science at Uppsala University. You are also an Associate Research Fellow at the Swedish Institute of International Affairs. And both of you are here because you have such great interest in the city. But before I open up for you, I just want to say that, of course, we're very happy that we have such a big audience today. And for those of you who are interested in posing questions, if you watch via Zoom, you ask questions in the Q&A. And if you watch via Facebook, you ask questions in the comment section. And you can do that during the seminar, and we will collect those questions and make sure we have time to answer them towards the end. So then, Kristin and Ivan, I wanted to ask both of you, why did you become so interested in the city as a sort of object of your research in the first place? Kristin, if we begin with you.
Well, my background is actually in international relations and international security. And as a PhD student, I more or less stumbled across this literature on global cities coming out of urban sociology and geography. And I think I first read this book by Saskia Sassen, The Global City. And I remember feeling almost upset that, you know, how come no one told me about this before? And I felt like, how is it possible that the entire IR, international relations community, have completely missed this? How come this literature is out there without anyone recognizing this incredible, interesting, I mean, the economical, the political role of cities for, global developments? So, I mean, in IR, we talk about globalization, transnational actors, non-state actors, global orders, but had completely missed the role of cities. So I sort of made it my mission during my PhD studies to marry the IR literature on global governance and globalization and the global cities literature, because I think it was a blind spot, really, in the IR literature and for international security, really.
And now, of course, you've taken that knowledge, and now when you moved into more sort of critical war studies, you can build on that. What about you, Ivan?
Well, mine is a little bit more sudden, or not planned. But I sort of I was recruited as a student, as a research assistant in a sort of research project where the project leader wanted to sort of pursue post-war cities. So I sort of slipped into it by no doing of my own. But then I was stuck with sort of I was fascinated with cities and how many nuances they have. They're so that they have so many contradictions, that they have people can live very peacefully next to another, and at the same time just blocks the way. You can have conflict, etc. So it's like, I'm going to talk more about it, I think, but the city holds so many contradictions, and that sort of fascinated me in many different ways. but also just, I just love the way urban scholars write. So I stuck with that as well. I also come from a more IR background, and it's stylistically it's much more fun. So it's a less sort of academic,
Right.
reason for it, but.
So really your studies have been focused on the post-war city.
Yes.
And we'll get back to the connection between city and peace a little bit later, but let's first focus on the connection between the city and war. So why are cities targeted in war? Kristin, can you begin?
Well, I believe for many reasons, but primarily perhaps because of what they represent, what they symbolize. I mean, cities have always been sort of the locus of power, politics, economics, culture, religion. So therefore, they have also been central as trophies, a prize in war. I mean, from a purely military perspective, there are a lot of strategically, you can get a lot of advantages by controlling or capturing certain cities, and the control and capture of certain cities can actually determine the entire conflict. We know, for example, that the international community, the practices of the international community tends to be, when the warring parties when one of the warring parties actually control the capital city, that's when the international community will sort of recognize that part as the winning side of the war. We saw that in Kabul, for example, in Afghanistan, when the Taliban took Kabul, it was over. They had basically won. So, controlling certain cities have been central for that reason. But also, I mean, beyond the purely military consideration, cities represent the chance to obliterate a cultural or political enemy because of, what they represent, and to obliterate the collective memory of a certain people or an enemy. So, they're both political and military reasons, I think, for this.
So what about the city as a site for infrastructure?
Of course, I mean, the city will be filled also with, in a sense, legitimate military targets in terms of energy, infrastructure, transport, of course. So, from a military point of view, the city is filled with that, but it goes way beyond that also, I think, for political reasons and for what certain cities symbolize in terms of culture. And I think we see that in Ukraine, that cities are destroyed because of what they represent, basically.
Can you give some examples of what is being destroyed?
I mean, we have, there are many reports of the cultural sites in Ukraine representing, in particular, Ukrainian culture that is not necessarily, the Russian heritage, but the specifically Ukrainian culture that are being targeted, museums and other cultural sites, in order to basically, erase the Ukrainian nation and specifically Ukrainian collective memory. So sometimes we talk about culture side, for example.
Culture side. So is that linked then to the cultural heritage of the city?
Exactly.
So what you bring up here is mainly like infrastructure. We talked about that, the cultural heritage, and also, of course, government buildings and so on.
And the economic power. I mean, also typically situated in urban areas.
But when you have a war in a city, of course, the city is where you have lots of people. So how does urban warfare in particular affect people? I mean, why does it become so horrible? Maybe Ivan, do you have a comment on that?
Well, I think there's one simple answer and then one more complex. One is, cities are one of the main definitions of a city is, densely populated area. And, if you have more people in the same place, a bomb or whatever can, make more damage. So people are concentrated there. So if you bomb it, it's going to have more effect. I think that's the sort of the easy answer. The more complex one is that cities are, depending where you come from or what you look for, you're going to understand a city differently. But often people would see a city as a very complex organism, a very fragile one that has many different, is a network, a system, or whatever you want to call it. But it's very, very fragile, and it's a very unsustainable entity as well. So no city is self-sustainable. It depends on others for food. It depends on others for water. Most cities don't, they have to transport water, etc. So what you have then is that, because it's so complex, you can just destroy a water plant and then hundreds of thousands of people don't have any water to drink. You can have a siege of it, and then food can't reach it, and then people starve. So it's the whole that they're so complex. So when you destroy them, a little part of them sort of has ripple effects, but also because they need things from the outside. And if you sort of limit that, then very quickly people start suffering much more.
So compared to people living in the countryside,
Yeah.
then that the city folks have bigger challenges in a way.
Yeah, because it's much harder to be self-sufficient in a city. And you have less advanced and less developed infrastructure, which means usually that you're worse off, all things equal, but you're also less vulnerable for disruptions in these kind of systems. So if you go and if you don't have tap water, then you go and find in a lake, but if you don't have a lake and you have tap water and it runs out, then where are you going to get your water from? So it's that the complexity of cities is sort of both what makes life in them good, but also why they're so easy to destroy and disrupt.
And of course, like centers of people have always been in focus for warfare in one way or another. And we can go back to ancient Greece and so on to see that cities do play a really important role in warfare. Ivan, you want to add something?
Yeah, I want to add, because Kristin was talking about the symbolism of cities, as the control, etc. It's where power lays, and so you have that symbolic aspect, but you also have the symbolic aspect is that, I think I'm going to talk about it more, but cities are usually where people, they're both sort of symbols of coexistence of different faiths, of different kinds of people, ethnic groups, political affiliation, whatever. It is where diverse form of people coexist. They're both actually that, but there are also symbols of that. And often war are those who fight war often have this idea and want to perpetuate this idea that we can't live with them, etc., etc. And cities then become the symbol that actually we can live together, and that's a symbol you want to destroy. So I know there's been research on it on Sarajevo that a lot of it, a lot of the targeting in the city was not focused on purely military, strategic, or tactical aspects. Okay, we need to destroy this building or whatever to advance, but they would target sites or symbols of coexistence. For instance, an open market where you would people from all sides would trade, because that sort of disrupts the idea that we cannot live together.
Right, so that's a really interesting aspect of the city, I think. And of course, I know that you've studied a lot the divided cities, and we have several divided cities, and we could get back to that topic. But I think in relation to then warfare, does this mean that warfare in the urban context the violence that needs to be used, does that look different in a city than in other places? Kristin, can you say something about that?
Well, I mean, first of all, I also want to come back to this, why is it so horrible and destruction often so complete in urban warfare? And I think coming back to this, the practice of the international community to sort of I mean, the strategic value of controlling or capturing certain cities, typically capital cities. I mean, it gives the warring parties absolutely no incentive to keep the cities themselves intact or the citizens secure. It doesn't matter if it's complete rubble, but as long as you're in control, you're winning the war, basically. So that's why we have also seen, I think, the complete destruction of so many cities because of their strategic value. We've seen it in Mogadishu or Brazzaville or Kabul and these types of examples. And I also think that this is also why the brutality of urban warfare is, I mean, if we compare it to, warfare in open terrain, in the urban setting, and this is also why I think it's exceptionally scary also for soldiers. It requires highly trained soldiers because armies are typically trained for the open terrain to keep your enemy at a far distance. But when you enter the city, you very quickly come into close combat where you get your enemy very close. You get it in front of you, behind you, above you, perhaps even below you. And that is not something that armies are typically trained for. So, and it becomes really scary, and scared people do stupid things. And it's very difficult sometimes to, know the difference between soldiers and civilians, and civilians are the one that, end up being harmed.
And judging from what you've been saying, it's not that civilians are like only collateral damage when you go in with destruction in the city, but also actually targeted. For example, people coexisting and these kinds of places like markets or religious buildings and so on. So
yeah,
I would just want to come back also to, I completely agree with, cities being targeted and cities, the violence being there, but coming back to the contradiction I was talking about, because there's been research saying that actually, if we just take the basic elements of war, just scale it down, strip it down, it's, people being killed. If we limit the war to that, there's actually research saying that most people killed are actually not in cities. So we have this, that seems like a contradiction, is that we have the most brutal violence in cities, but at the same time you don't have the most people killed are not in cities. And I think that comes back to what Kristin was talking about. The cities are so important. They're so important for economy, for politics. It's where politicians live, etc., etc. And it's you can't win a war with them, but you can't win a peace without them. Or you can't win a war without them, but you can't also win the peace without them. And it's also, where aid comes in. It's also where peacekeepers come in, in the main airport, etc., etc. So that has actually led to, so this importance has led, on one hand, the cities are super targeted and very destroyed, but at the same time, often they become safe havens because their importance makes it so important to keep them safe, because they have, economic revenue, politicians live there, they have infrastructure. Goma on the border between Rwanda and Congo is a typical city like that. So you had a lot of fighting outside of the city, but then the city, because it was so important to so many people, is actually seen as a safe haven because it's on the borders. There's a lot of smuggling, there's a lot of revenues, etc., etc. So Goma actually became relatively less secure after the war ended because its importance wasn't that important anymore.
Oh, that's fascinating. Really fascinating. So from Goma, I want to move back to Ukraine, because Kristin, you recently wrote a very interesting article about how the war, how it plays out in the Ukrainian war urbanscape, and how that you argue that it's not consistent with how Western militaries have been conceptualizing and thinking about how war in the urban is going to look like. So,
yeah, well, my argument here is I mean, it's quite simple actually, and it's about the context in which we see this urban war unfolding. And I mean, we've seen in recent years that a lot of Western military organizations, the British Army, the American Army, NATO, they have been very preoccupied with this idea of the future urban warfare, or that future war will be urban. And so they have, you know, had a lot of development projects, conceptual development, doctrinal development, and the focus in these projects have been very much of, or the imagined, the way that these organizations have envisioned the future urban war has been in the context of expeditionary warfare, counterinsurgency.
What does expeditionary warfare mean?
You know, fighting wars far away from the European continent, or from, you know, the global north, basically, doing counterinsurgency operations in faraway cities of the, you know, global cities of the global south, or, you know, in dysfunctional cities in the Middle East, for example.
Would
basically,
Kabul be an example of this?
Exactly, or what we've seen in Iraq, for example, where the idea is that Western forces will have to intervene to fight rebels or insurgents in situations of, you know, dysfunctional cities, failing states, where there will be an asymmetrical war, a non-conventional war against non-state groups who will be hiding in the cities and using the urban terrain to their advantage by hiding among civilians. So very tricky situation in terms of, you know, the laws of armed conflict, because of the presence of civilians, and because they will be hiding and not be, you know, conventional forces. This is what basically I think many Western organizations have been preparing for. And the way what we see now in Ukraine is war in well-functioning European cities, two conventional armies fighting, and it's the Ukrainians who basically use the urban terrain to their advantage against, well, superior force, at least in terms of firepower. And this really sort of flips the entire context around. It's basically a reverse situation in comparison what, for example, NATO have seen itself having to prepare. It's not, when NATO has prepared for urban warfare, it's not in well-functioning European or North American cities. So this is, I mean, it's the context is really flipped around a bit.
So what implications does that have then for NATO and other actors?
I'm not sure exactly, but I mean, I would argue that we are seeing herbicide happening in Europe right now. And I don't think that this is something that has been really prepared for. And I'm not sure that military organizations are the one that should prepare for that, because I think it's more of a political issue. But yeah, it's I'm not sure what the consequences of this will be, but it's definitely not something that I think we have prepared for.
Let me just stop you there and ask about this concept of herbicide. You both use this in your research. Ivan, do you want to say something about it?
Well, herbicide, I don't know if maybe we have different...
yeah, but it would be interesting to see if you have.
Well, herbicide is basically the idea of destroying a city. And I think it can be both, I think, on the very material side, you know, destroying the infrastructure of you know, food logistics, of water, of sewage, which leads to, you know, more infectious diseases, etc. So the whole, coming back where I spoke earlier about the complex organism that is the city, but also the whole idea which you both talked about, and I did as well, of, you know, cities being where culture is, cities being where coexistence is, you know, actually happening, but also symbol of it is destroying that sort of thing.
So it's the actual targeting of that,
yes,
urbanity in a way, I suppose.
Yeah, exactly.
And what about you, Kristin?
Yeah, I mean, even though it is quite problematic as a concept, I think it is useful, and I think it does point to something that is not genocide or culturecide, and it's about what you were actually talking about, and what you talked about before, Ivan, about what urbanity represents, and the heterogeneity of cities, the tolerance, the cosmopolitanism. And I think that in the Balkans, I think we saw really the sort of quintessential examples of urbicide in the city of Vukovar, for example, that was targeted because of people living together in peace across ethnic groups, intermarrying, living side by side in tolerance. And that's one of the aspects I think that is captured by the term urbicide, that is why cities are being targeted, because what they represent, because of the tolerance, because of the way of urban life, basically.
Yeah, and that's quite a sort of unique thing. It can be hard to actually pinpoint what is that urbanity, and we can find it in cities all across the world that might be very different, but they still have this. We'll get back to that, but I just wanted to, you now mentioned the Balkans, and now when you were talking about saying that urbicide is going on in a European kind of well-organized city, of course we saw that already 3 decades ago in Sarajevo. You mentioned Vukovar, and although you're not a researcher of war, but you have experienced war in the Balkans, and you have done most of your research there. So can you see any, maybe it's hard to draw parallels to Ukraine, but now living with the war in Ukraine, what are your reflections from your Balkan experience?
Yeah. I don't know if I'm living with the Ukrainian war, but I'm living at the same time as it. I don't know. I think in many ways, so we always been that they were very much targeted cities, because that's where people fled. And we also see that in war-torn countries, the urbanization tends to, so Colombia is a good example, you know, it's more urban than neighboring countries, but because of the war, because cities, when they're not very much targeted, they tend to be safer. So people, you know, and they have job opportunities, etc. So, you know, and police, etc. So Colombia is quite urbanized because of its sort of long conflict. So you had people fleeing to cities, in some sense, to sort of escape, but also from Sarajevo, fleeing from Sarajevo, and it was very much targeted. Sarajevo and Mostar were very much targeted as symbols of coexistence and etc. But also, but from a war perspective, I don't know. I think. Because Sarajevo was longest siege since Leningrad, and I think it was actually longer than Leningrad, and I think it quite illustrated the sort of difficulties of capturing the city. And so you have the Bosnian Herzegovinian army, which was comparatively had, use a word term, less firepower, and all of these other things that militaries have, but it still managed to. They still managed to keep the Serbian forces at bay, because I think of the city, because it is so incredibly hard to take over a city. And the same was in Mostar, where it was the eastern part especially was bombed to pieces, but they still stood, because it's very hard to capture cities. It's very, very, very hard.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we saw in Ukraine, especially in Mariupol, I think we heard a lot of the military experts, you know, week after week, it's going to fall, and then they just kept, you know, not yielding. So it is exceptionally hard to take a city. I mean, bombing it to pieces
Yeah.
is quite easy if you have enough ammunition and weapons, but actually taking it, and it's hard.
Because people can hide. I remember there was this urban warfare guide circulated that was translated to Ukrainian of, you know, how you should fight an urban war. And the whole idea was, yes, you can bomb the city to pieces, but then these pieces, you can hide in them, you know, and then it's harder to see if somebody's hiding in a, you know, bombed to pieces house than, you know, another, you know, so bombing, it actually provides people with more cover, and you know, so it's very
concrete is very useful, and,
exactly.
and it resists a lot, you know, so
Interesting. Also, civilian resistance in cities. We have seen many examples of that in Ukrainian cities, and also we have many examples from Sarajevo. I'm thinking about resistance through art, through demonstrations, through those kinds of actions that seem to be somehow also linked to the urban space. Ivan, you have done quite a lot of research on
not on war, but yes,
no, but it's
but it is. It both tends to. I think, I don't know how necessarily valuable in military terms that resistance is, but I think both cities tend to have more people that are willing to coexist. So that means, you know, there's a lot, and they concentrate, so there's a larger concentration of people that are against war, etc. But also I think the whole idea that you, the herbicide, the idea of herbicide, that you do not destroy a city just because it's sort of something you want to take, but what it represents, what it is, how it functions, then it becomes the resistance to that, showing the enemy that they haven't succeeded, is sort of continuing living with that, you know, that urban life, you know, be it arranging concerts or, you know, just putting up makeup and etc. Just living your life. I think that's a form of resistance. But I don't know how much. I think you're better with that. How much resistance civilians can actually do to a fighting party.
Yeah, but I think also, I mean, in terms of cities being, you know, what they represent, I think at least in the beginning of the Arab Spring, where we saw the resistance and the uprising spreading from city to city in the Middle East, you know, using social media, and I mean, that is also a very, I think social movements are also in that sense a very urban phenomenon. So there is a lot of potential within. It's not just about, you know, what the global world spins into the cities, but also what's being spun out, basically. What the cities have a lot of potential for spreading new ideas, ways of organizing, you know, your political life and social life, and that's so the potential for resistance, I think, is also very interesting in urban space.
I mean, if we just look at it, like, cities have, you know, through history been a target for, not necessarily a military target, but a target and seeing something bad for conservative forces, you know, be it, you know, it's where women go and liberate themselves, to, you know, where gay people go and, you know, live like they want to, you know, so city, or, you know, where just people protest. I mean, Paris looks the way it does because Haussmann, Paris was very densely, it was like the old city in Stockholm, it was very, very much built like that, but that actually made it easy for people to just put up barricades and, you know, burn, and, you know, it was very hard to police and control people. So the big avenues or roads of Paris are actually not necessarily only, but they're partly like that because it's way harder to control for the population, and it's much easier for the military and the police to have the, you know, to sort of utilize their advantage in firepower, which they always have. So I think cities have always been somewhere where, you know, those in power don't like them, and those against power concentrate.
it seems like this also has to do with that cities are hard to control in various ways, and that I mean, war tends to have a homogenizing kind of dividing power or a force in society, and cities are, of course, then both something to attack, but also a place for resistance, and to move on to also a site for peace building then, because, you know, eventually peace will come, and that peace might not be like might just be like the absence of violence, but it's still something will change, and there will be possibilities for peace building in some sense. And this is really what you have been studying, Ivan.
Yes, I have.
In various cities.
Yes. So what was the more concrete question?
Well, there wasn't really a concrete question. It was an opening up for you to. So yeah, the question can be, so what is particular for the city when it comes to peace building?
Well, so if I just take it a little bit, because cities are, you know, theorized and actually, like we talked about, where different people sort of do coexist. And much of my earlier research was, you know, there is this potential, why is not materializing? Because we see, rather than, you know, Mostar or Sarajevo or Belfast, which are, you know, cities I've studied, rather than them being sort of beacons of hope and, you know, where people actually do start living together after war, they sort of, or Jerusalem, you know, they tend to be places where there's a continuation of the conflict of war, where the entrenchment is most sort of deep. And I think that goes back to, you know, because they're so important, you know, they can't be lost either to the other side nor to these hippies who want to live together. But then doing that research, I actually saw there is also a lot of this potential, or the potential is being materialized, and potential lies in many different ways of how the city functions. So from, you know, and, you know, I've conceptualized it in different ways of coexistence, different ways of living together, but, you know, city brings people together. So, you know, so the sort of the person you maybe see on television or in propaganda or whatever, that person comes very close to you. You sort of have to meet the other side in a city, even if it is divided or etc. It's very much close. So people can meet each other, and from there they can see, oh, we're not that different, or we have same problems, etc. And then, you know, relationships form. But then you have another part, you know, that the cities sort of need to be coexisting to function as cities. You know, they're centers of trade, right? But to trade or innovation or whatever, but for trade or innovation to function, people sort of have to accept others. There's also the idea that, you know, cities are so hard to control. I mean, you can't engage with every person on the street, which means that you sort of have to, you have to accept that you're in the presence, potentially in the presence of other people. Two, cities being hard to control. So, you know, those, for instance, in an international atmosphere, those cities, those who want to coexist, that they can always find a place in the city, either in the street because of the anonymity of a city, or just because cities always have uncontrollable places, basements, you know, are, you know, where people can hide their sort of coexistence. So there's a lot of parts and dynamics of the city that enable people who want to coexist, but also force people to coexist because, you know, the city that doesn't function.
So what you're really talking about here, Ivan, I think it's like a kind of everyday piece that goes on in like how people interact in the streets, or, you know, meet in cafes maybe, and try to build up a sort of sociability through that. And it makes me think about the research that you've done in Mitrovica in Kosovo around the bridge and the contestations around that. Maybe you can say something. How does that play out? And when you think about that, let me just also encourage the audience to like really ask questions. We'll have some time the last 10 minutes or so. So please just post your questions in the chat function on either Facebook or on Zoom, wherever you're watching, and we'll see what kind of interesting answers we can get. So back to Mitrovica and Ivan.
Yes, so Mitrovica, so I usually used to study Mitrovica because of its division, but now I study it because of its coexistence.
So there's been a change, or is it your interest that has changed?
Both. There's been a change in both. So and there you have all of the different examples of what I was talking about. So you have that has changed. So you have quite a vibrant NGO sector in Mitrovica.
So maybe you can just say something about Mitrovica first.
So Mitrovica is in northern Kosovo, and the southern part, it was quite mixed before the war. It was seen as the rock city. It was like a cultural beacon, and it was quite mixed. I think one sort of now it's mostly Serbs in the north and almost exclusively Albanians in the south, and there's a river Ibar that goes through the city. But sort of the Islamic or Muslim cemeteries in the north and the Orthodox one is in the south, which just illustrates that it wasn't divided like it is today. So I've been studying that. So you have a very vibrant NGO sector that try to bring youth together. That there have been okay success. There's still a lot of things that need to be done, but more and more they're sort of both bringing themselves together, but also bringing children, youth together, and then these maybe meet at the event that it's organized for them to meet, but then and often that doesn't work, but sometimes they can just meet and say, okay, I like you, and then they communicate in English, because language, the language is different, but I mean, it's not a barrier if there's a will, so to speak. So you have that, which is the sort of people meet, they see, I like you, even though you're a Serb or Albanian, and then we continue hanging out with each other. But then you also have this the sort of economic aspect of the whole thing, that people just need to accommodate each other. For instance, in northern Mitrovica, the medicines are both cheaper, better controlled, and sort of there's more variety. So Albanians are sort of more and more starting to go north to sort of go and buy medicine, while Serbs, for instance, go, because Mitrovica, it's the northern part is against the mountains, so it's very hard to build in the open. So you have a couple of supermarkets in just on the southern sort of Albanian part of the city that a lot of Serbs go. And but that started in 2014, 15. I remember, people, the Serbs going there, being a little bit, they're being a little bit careful, and maybe not buying bags in that shop, because then also Serbs, they're afraid of Albanians, but also Serbs in the north saying, "Oh, you're a traitor, you're buying in Albanian shops." But then, I came back last year, and I would just heard, people, Serbs speaking Serbian very loudly, more in deep in the city. And so that is sort of developing as well. But also one thing, and this is maybe a little bit more radical idea of coexistence, is that the two parts, they exist and function very much apart, but at the same time, that makes people quite comfortable with the way of things, So they've actually existed quite apart since the war, but that, at the one hand, they're sort of living side by side, but on the other hand, there's the biggest and only city in Kosovo where both Serbians and Albanians live to a high extent. So this sort of ability of a city to function in divide, being, but people
side by side,
people can be secluded into their area, then that's safe for them, and then they can venture out if they want to meet. I think that is something that the city allows people to do, to both sort of feel that they're very much with their own kind, but also then can venture out quite easily, which you can't, and you know, you can't have that seclusion on the countryside where you can choose if you want to interact or not. So I think for my idea, I'm taking my time, but just my idea, that the division of the city has actually been what enabled its sort of mixture, and what after some time has enabled people to start interacting across. Because if it hadn't been divided 20 years ago, I think it would either become a Serbian or Albanian city, and then this more intense coexistence wouldn't have been possible today.
I think it's interesting. I mean, both when you talk about Mitrovica and about Goma, there seems to be this element also of like trade. Well, it's like basically shopping.
Yes.
That seems to be creating these spaces for coexistence. So let's zoom out a little bit now and think about from Mitrovica, and then thinking about, you know, we all have these images of these cities in rubbles like Aleppo and so on. I mean, how, if we think about the big kind of international interventions that usually are put in motion, you know, once the war sort of, or the weapons become at least silenced. What you're saying now, is this some kind of insight that should be, that can sort of guide international interventions when it comes to how to rebuild, how to support that reconstruction of the cities? What did you think about in this, these big interventions? Any ideas? I'm opening up for both of you.
I'm not, I mean, the first thing that I came to think about when you raised that question was not about the big international interventions, but how we see already, for example, in relation to Ukraine, plans for rebuilding all these destroyed cities, and the people that are actually engaging in this issue are, you know, international networks of architects and city planners that are starting to think about, you know, rebuilding these cities. And also, I mean, actually in terms of the opportunities that comes with, you know, in terms of sustainability and, you know, what kind of, you know, energy should we use, and that there are actually, you know, some opportunities are presenting themselves when you need to rebuild. And that there is actually a lot of, I think, things happening already, you know, with plans where international architects are becoming engaged. So I don't know, maybe I'm being cynical, but I'm not sure that it's going to be the international community and international intervention that's going to matter. I think we'll see.
In Ukraine now, you mean? Yeah.
I think it shouldn't matter, because if I go to answer your question, I think where we would, you know, would be, I'm not done with this research, and probably never will be research being research, but I would say international community should sit in the back seat and help either, you know, our local architects and, you know, in these sort of networks that start thinking about these things, assist them with what they need, or where locally people formulate, you know, because for me it's a lot about socioeconomics and, like you said, economy. You know, that's people after war, you know, they don't care about much else, you know, but having a roof over their head and, you know, putting food on the table, while the international community historically has come in and, you know, made, you know, grand gestures, big projects. I remember, you know, reading research about Mostar, where, you know, they make a big fuss about reconstructing the bridge, the old bridge that was destroyed. First, the division in Mostar doesn't go at the bridge, so it wasn't a reconciliation aspect at all. But at the same time, they invested so much money, while the other bridges were not repaired, and people were saying, yeah, that's fine, thank you, but, you know, can you help give us jobs and maybe repair the other things, the other actually everyday important infrastructure, etc. So I think it shouldn't be internationally. If they want to help, sit in back seat and let local people decide what they need.
Send the money.
Yeah, exactly. But because I know a lot of NGO activists, that work with, and they just have to jump around a lot of hoops, sort of, so that their projects, fit into the international aid infrastructure, so that they get funding, and then they try to do what they actually want to do, while being able to take the box and say, we actually did the, so it's a lot of balancing, because it's not it's donor driven rather than needs based a lot of the time. But that is general, not only for cities.
So would you say that it is possible to reverse an herbicide?
Yes. It depends on what we mean by herbicide. But I think there are very few examples of cities in the history of humankind where cities have been destroyed, killed completely in war, and not been, rebirthed or rebuilt. I think there are very few examples where a city has been destroyed and not come to life again. I'm sure that there will be very different dynamics and changes perhaps, but yeah.
And I think that goes in hand with the whole idea that it's actually very hard to destroy a city, because sort of it's not just the concrete, but it's the people, and as long as you don't kill it off completely, it's not killed off, and it's sort of rebirth, not necessarily rebirths, but sort of rebuilds, regenerates, because it's very, yes, it's never been like that, but it's also, I think, very rare that you've had cities that actually been completely destroyed, because it is always someone, even I just listened to the news this morning that there's still people, 3,000 out of 70 in Bakhmut, but there's still people living in the city, because it's very hard to actually kill off all of them.
All of the people, but I think, in Grozny, for example, more than 90% of every building was destroyed, and I think the same in Mariupol. But I think you can destroy, make it into complete rubble. But in terms of, I don't think it's possible to sort of kill off its the urbanity, or the urban fabric can be harmed, but it's going to come to life again.
We have some questions now from the audience, and one is a very interesting question that's linked to the cultural heritage of the city. And now it's not about the cultural heritage that needs to be, that's from before and that has some positive connotations, but also that the war creates some kind of new cultural heritage, the memories from the violence. For example, there are many buildings and so on that are being used as prisons and centers where torture takes place, the question is. So they can create this association for citizens between places in the city and the war. And so in post-war settings, how do cities work with that? So that it's not just rebuilding in the physical sense, but also in a way, a psychological sense. How can you do that when you have these scars in the urbanscape that represents this violence?
Well, how do they deal with it? Well, I think obviously you can't keep everything as is, as a memory, because then people won't have anywhere to live. But I think what's often done is that you keep a couple of places sort of sacred, and sort of make them into museums or these kind of things. So I think that's been done a lot, but it's also quite hard, because that's not, because after the war, the capital comes in. So you have a regeneration of buildings for profit, you know, and then often somebody owns these buildings and they need money. So it's a complete different dynamic, which you see in normal non-war cities as well, where you have a sort of where you have capital invested in properties. So it's very hard. So I think it's very hard to do that.
Right.
But mine would be, what I've seen in cities is that usually they keep a couple of places for a reminder, but then, you know, you need to rebuild other places.
But it might be, my suggestion would be maybe it's also linked to commemoration and to recognition of the victims, and that some of these spaces are important to keep for that, for that reason.
And I mean, in the best case scenario, these memorial places can be sites of reconciliation and, you know, collective memories and identities. But I think also that there are a lot of examples where these memorials from wars become in themselves sites of conflict. And I mean, in the US, for example, there are so many of these old statues of generals from the South that, you know, is, you know, highly problematic in relation, you know, the Black Lives Matter movement. And that
I think, Kristin, I have to catch you there, because I think this is really the topic for another webinar. So we'll keep that, because we have some more questions and we only have a few more minutes left. So we have one question from Thomas Melin. Refugees are today mainly urban, over 60%, say the UN. Previously, refugees were always in rural camps. And how do you look upon this change?
You were.
I'm not sure. I have.
Well, you did. I think one of you did say something before about that. The urban centers are attracting.
Yeah, exactly. So I don't know this. I'm not that well versed in the history of migration, but so I can't really answer about the change. But usually, so the trend in human societies is urbanization. It's been very much so. It's where the opportunities are, you know, where, you know, so refugees tend to seek out cities because of that. You know, you have opportunities for work, etc. But then cities are more tolerant, so you're less likely to suffer because you're a refugee. But also there's also this idea, well, you talked about it, cities are very hard to control, so it's refugees who maybe who are deemed illegal, etc., can hide easily in cities, etc., etc. So I would say, you know, that a lot of the aspects of the city would attract people to cities, being, you know, marginalized per se, or refugees or whatever. I don't know if there has been a change over time and why this change has been. I just know why people come to cities.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure either if I could say anything about, you know, refugees in particular, but, you know, in terms of migration and urbanization, I think, I mean, I guess, I mean, it's a classic by now, Mike David's Planet of Slums, where he basically argues that the push, the urban push now is different from what it used to be, especially when in Western Europe or North America, when urbanization was really driven by, you know, there was actually work in the cities, the industrialization and all of this, where people actually had work to come to. But here the push into cities, you know, a lot of places around the world is a push into slums, and where there is, you know, informal economies and no actual, not real jobs. So the urbanization patterns now differs from before. I'm not sure if that connects also to how refugees are.
Maybe.
We just have a few more seconds left now, and we have one last question that we can deal with, and that's from Daniela Johnson. I'm wondering if there, in your experiences, are any visible differences in urban warfare that can be connected to segregation? So the connection between segregation in cities and urban warfare.
I don't know, actually. That's a really interesting question. Not that I'm, not something that I've seen in particular, but it's an interesting question, but I'm not sure I can give an answer to it.
There's more segregate, cities tend to segregate during war. That is very much so, because of the homogenizing effects. So people would, for instance, cities I study, people who live, there will be very few areas that are mixed and where it's acceptable or people want to live there. So, it will either be one or the other side. And so people would move. Often they just maybe switch buildings with somebody they know, but, making them safer, on their side. And then, so in Mostar, it was very much mixed city, but then during the war, the left side became Bosniak.
You have this kind of separation.
Yeah.
Well, I think we have reached the end of our hour, and I just really want to thank the both of you for sharing your expertise on the city and war and the city and peace. And thank you so much to the audience as well for joining us and for posing such interesting and relevant questions. So thank you.